Darksiders 3 is a disappointing game, or at least it was for a lot of people, and it's pretty clear to see why. It's the weakest game in the Darksiders series, it's significantly smaller than Darksiders 2, it's less technically competent than Darksiders 1, and it made a lot of contrary and disappointing creative choices to long-time fans. Unfortunately, Darksiders 3 is one of those games that's pretty significantly different to the way that it was at launch. Tons of fixes and changes and rebalances have made the game into something much more refined than how it was at launch. And having only played the game years after it came out, that's the only version I can really talk about. Because of that separation, I can say many things about Darksiders 3. I can say it's weird, I can say it's a little broken, I can say it's underwhelming. But I never could quite bring myself to say it's bad. There's a lot of reasons why Darksiders 3 is the way it is. Vigil Games was shut down less than a year after the release of Darksiders 2 after their parent company, THQ, drove themselves into bankruptcy with poor management and bad investments, which led most people to assume that the Darksiders franchise was dead. But the series was eventually picked up again by Gunfire Games, one of the two studios founded in the wake of Vigil Games by a faction of the former employees. Not Jomad, though, the franchise's original creative director, who instead formed his own studio, Airship Syndicate. Keep an eye on them though, they're going places. This means that Darksiders 3 was made by a much smaller team on a much smaller budget than Darksiders 2, something that's almost completely unheard of for a AAA sequel. In fact, the team and budget behind Darksiders 3 was minuscule by 2018 standards. The game's market being as it is, this was an impossible situation. Sequels have to be bigger, but Darksiders 3 would have to be a smaller, less ambitious game than Darksiders 2 if it was ever going to exist at all. So yeah, Darksiders 3 is underwhelming. How could it not be? But you know what it is? Real. Because without taking that risk, Darksiders really would be dead in the water. And considering the circumstances of its creation, Darksiders 3 is a tremendous accomplishment, regardless of all the mean things I'm about to say about it.
Why did the Creator construct a universe teeming with imperfection, misery, sin? Among the scholars of both heaven and hell, this query is known as the Riddle of Sorrows.
Darksiders 3 is the story of Fury, Horsewoman of the Apocalypse, and her mission to defeat and contain the 7 deadly sins. Like Darksiders 2, it's a prequel filling in the story of another horseman during the time that War was imprisoned by the Charred Council. War even makes a little cameo here at the beginning as Fury is assigned her mission. Unlike Darksiders 2, the plot of Darksiders 3 is a lot more tangential to the first game, or at least it seems that way at first. The 7 deadly sins don't factor into the grand conspiracy. They're an unrelated side quest to the apocalypse that the series revolves around. That's because, much more than the previous games, Darksiders 3 is a story about Fury and not a story about the world of Darksiders. Fury strikes a very different figure to either war or death. In fact, to start out, Fury is a distinctly unlikable protagonist. She's arrogant, angry, boastful, and, without getting too mean, an absolute moron. She's on a quest to hunt down the 7 deadly sins, but she embodies pretty much all of them. She only agrees to undertake the mission as long as the council will declare her the leader of the horsemen and finally recognise her greatness.
I can handle those fools in my sleep, but when this task is complete, I demand that you grant me my rightful place leading the horsemen.
Making a game protagonist this unlikable is a big risk for a game, more so than it is for a TV show or a movie, because the plot of a game only moves forward if character and player are in agreement. Fury has no sense of honour like War, no sense of duty like death. She's an amoral, antisocial murderer. I'm not really rooting for her. But it's this counterintuitive decision that makes the story of Darksiders 3 really tick, because while Fury starts as the most unlikable horseman, she has the strongest arc. Because what is fighting sins if not a giant metaphor for character growth? The 7 sins have been unleashed upon the apocalyptic Earth, where they're causing havoc and increasing their own power. So Fury heads down there post-haste to stop them. But before she leaves, a Watcher decides to tag along with her. Not as a puppet master, just as, well, a Watcher. She's a big fan of Fury's work. This is where Darksiders 3 is the most underwhelming to me. These are aspects of the first game that Darksiders 2 deliberately avoided as much as possible, but Darksiders 3 returns to them in a much more traditional, sequel-y sort of way. We're once again exploring the fantasy apocalypse Earth with the help of a Watcher. The dynamic between Fury and this new Watcher is very different, but the setup is the same, and Darksiders 3 doesn't do much with Earth that the first game didn't already explore, and usually explored better. But that's probably not what most people will notice about the game first. The first thing most people will notice is how often they seem to be dying. Sticking with the tradition of making the coolest games possible, Darksiders 3 has evolved with the times. And in the 5 years between Darksiders 2 and 3, action RPGs had a new champion. The Souls-like, games inspired by the combat rhythms and many other rhythms of Dark Souls. The comparisons are pretty apparent. As always, Darksiders 3 is not shy about showcasing its inspirations. The combat has been reworked to be much harder and much more tactical, with no combo meter and a much bigger emphasis on well-timed dodges and counterattacks. Vulgrim has been upgraded from simple merchant to respawn anchor, just like the bonfires of Dark Souls. You have a limited supply of healing items that take a second to use, just like Estus flasks. You literally use souls to level up, exactly like Dark Souls. Even the way you find and collect items is identical to the way FromSoft games do it. There are things that Darksiders 3 doesn't do, things that make it much more of a Souls-light than a full Souls-like. The biggest omission is any kind of stamina system. There is no punishment for just wailing on things like there is in Dark Souls. There's also no blocking mechanic, just dodging. This shift in design is by far the most controversial thing about Darksiders 3. People going in expecting a more relaxed hack-and-slash experience were instead met with a traditional Dark Souls brick wall of difficulty, with a whole different system to master before you're allowed to progress through the story. Souls-likes hold a very weird position in the games industry. A lot of critics will hold them up as the pinnacle of game design, the gold standard that all games should be held to. But drowned in all that praise is any recognition that they are a niche product. My own journey with Souls-like was, and still is, a bit like my relationship with coffee. I love coffee now, but it's an acquired taste. It takes some time to get yourself into it because in the beginning it tastes like drinking dirt mixed with ashtrays. If you don't want to play a Souls-like, if you don't recognise getting stuck as part of the experience and instead just get frustrated after 3 tries at a boss, then you're going to quit and say the game sucks and move on. You need to go into a Souls-like with the mindset of playing a Souls-like, and understandably, most Darksiders fans at the time were not doing that. The funny thing is, Darksiders 3 is very easy by Souls-like standards. I had a much harder time with something like the Jedi games than I did with Darksiders 3. Once you figure out the right rhythm for the flashy dodge counter, every fight becomes very manageable. Fury's weapon, Scorn, is the weirdest of all the horsemen. It's a hilt that can transform into any other weapon the wielder can imagine. The default version that Fury uses, and your primary attack for the majority of the game, is the Barbs of Scorn, a whip made of daggers connected together with lightning. If the Barbs of Scorn were in Dark Souls, you would be shamed for using them by all the try-hard, get-good players. It's a fast, high-damage, long-range weapon with significant splash damage. It's great for crowd control and boss fights, and it has no drawbacks. To the point of making every other form of Scorn redundant, but that's a separate issue. In any other Souls-like, it would be one of the most powerful weapons in the game, and Darksiders 3 gives it to you right at the start. The combination of dodge counter, Scorn, and the many other overpowered magic abilities the game gives you makes Darksiders 3 a cakewalk compared to more traditional Souls-likes. That's not a bad thing. Darksiders 3 has my favourite combat of the series because it's the satisfying rhythms of a Souls-like with about a third of as much stress. But I totally understand why a lot of people disagree. It's a completely different rhythm to the last 2 games, and if you try to approach it like the previous games, and why would you do that? It's only a direct sequel to them, you will have an awful time. Going straight from Darksiders 2 to 3 without knowing about this genre shift will give you whiplash you could sue over. The difficulty was such a prevailing criticism that Gunfire patched in a classic combat mode a few months after launch, which rebalances the game to play a bit more like the classic games, speeding up your attacks, making healing faster, making you take less damage, and most critically, allowing you to dodge mid-attack animation. And I get why they did that, but it's always a bit of a shame to see designers forced to make compromises on their ideas and goals. I do not view the pivot into Souls-like as cynical or cash-grabby, because it's perfectly in keeping with the thesis of the series. Game designers following their own interest and making the games that they want to make. I don't think Gunfire was cynically trying to entice Souls-like fans into the series. I think they think Dark Souls is really cool and wanted to play around with some of those same ideas, in exactly the same way they approached Zelda or God of War as influences on the previous games. The mistake was assuming that their audience would just roll with such a fundamental change to the core gameplay of the series. Gamers make a fuss over minor changes, let alone a pivot as big as this. I end up arguing against this kind of backlash a lot, but it's fundamental to human nature. Change is scary. The gut reaction of most people when something changes is to dislike it and want the old thing again, long before they've evaluated if the new thing is actually better or worse. And that's not to say this is a smooth transition. Darksiders 3 is an easy Souls-like, not the best Souls-like by any stretch of the imagination. Leveling up, for example, feels like a very half-baked implementation. There's only 3 stats to upgrade, and those stats are health, damage, and arcane damage, which is to say the damage of your magic attacks and dodge counters. Having the option to choose between which of these stats you want to put points into is pointless because they're all very basic. You want all 3 of them to be going up. It's clearly in here because this is how leveling up works in Dark Souls, but Dark Souls has a huge list of attributes to invest in for different builds and playstyles that Darksiders 3 does not have. As the game progresses, you unlock hollows, which are different elemental modes you can use for different spells in combat and various traversal mechanics we'll talk about in a bit. But each hollow also unlocks a new form of scorn, like a big hammer or a lance. The twist is that you can only use each weapon while you're using the hollow it came with. On Xbox at least, these hollow weapons map to Y, whereas the barbs are always mapped to X, which means fighting with the hollow weapons always feels awkward and pointless, and none of them are as powerful or as satisfying to use as the barbs. It's a cool idea, but very poorly implemented. Darksiders 3 doesn't have nearly the same kind of enemy variety as other Souls-like. In fact, the vast majority of enemies in the game are enemies who've already appeared in either Darksiders 1 or 2, just reworked to fit into the new combat system. The same roster of angels, demons, skeletons, and ghouls with just a couple new additions. One of the absolute weirdest though is this floating chair guy who seems to be a demon reskin of Jeremiah from Darksiders 2, which is very weird. Also, I cannot stress enough that the version of Darksiders 3 which exists now is very different to the one at launch. First of all, it works, which was not true for a lot of people at launch, but a bunch of stuff has been added to smooth out the experience. Rebalances, adding more checkpoints and items, things that have brought the game up to a level of polish it was clearly lacking at launch, and still lacking in some cases even now. Darksiders 3 contains a missing file texture. This shipping container is missing its texture, and so it's just displaying with the default grey texture of Unreal Engine. I have literally never seen a game with this issue before, not a major AAA game, nor an indie title. And the game has been out for over 6 years and they've never fixed it. It's not an isolated issue either, there's rooms full of these missing textures. I am very forgiving of these things because I know the details of the game's production. Small team, small budget, studio that was literally split in half, but most players are understandably not as informed as me. They see a price, they see the quality in front of them, and they judge accordingly. I do think that even with its flaws, the pivot to this style of combat and gameplay was a creatively interesting one. Because much like Death in Darksiders 2, I think this style fits Fury. War is a tank, Death is an assassin, Fury is the team mage. She's not nearly as durable as War or as quick as Death, but as a mage she is highly adaptable, and adaptability is the Dark Souls thing. It wasn't implemented as well as it could have been, but the creative impulse is clear. The other place where the Dark Souls influence shines the most is the level design. Rather than being built around Zelda-like dungeons like the first 2 games, Darksiders 3's map is a moderately sized area of intricately interconnected different zones. This meant 2 equally controversial changes, the removal of the map and the removal of the horse. The map is gone because that's the Souls-like way, navigating by landmarks, although the game does give you a compass that points towards the nearest sin. The horse is gone because it simply wouldn't fit within this scale of level design. It barely fits in Darksiders 1 and this map is even tighter. So Rampage the horse is killed within the first few hours of the game. And I get why this bothers people, she's a horseman without a horse. But frankly the horse mechanics are kind of rubbish in both previous games and I don't miss them. It's not all drastic changes. While it abandons the dungeons, Darksiders 3 does not abandon the puzzles, which are still scattered throughout the world. They're much easier than the previous game's puzzles, usually only requiring 1 or 2 steps to solve, but it is at least a break from all the stabbing, even if the game seems to be weirdly resentful of their inclusion.
So, 3 swords total?
So it seems.
It's always 3, isn't it?
Pardon?
3 keys. 3 stones, 3 swords. Rather predictable, don't you think?
Have you lost your mind?
No. I just hate it when the creator takes shortcuts.
Hey, Fury, don't do my job for me. Rule of 3s, it's a very useful shorthand, okay? Traversal challenges end up being much more important than traditional puzzles, along with a Metroidvania approach where new hollows allow you to access new areas of old places. Like using the Flame Hollow to walk through lava, or using the Force Hollow to walk underwater or turn into a big gravity ball and roll on walls. The way that these paths unlock different connections to different areas and create a big web of interconnectedness in your head is quite cool. But as you walk through the same areas over and over, you also get exposed to what is, in my opinion, the most disappointing part of the whole game, the art direction. It's partly because we're following up Darksiders 2, which is a tremendous looking game, but Darksiders 3 has severely muddled and messy art direction. There are highs. Fury herself looks excellent. In fact, she has my favourite design of all 4 horsemen. The pink hair that flows like fire, the face tattoos, the weird eyeball on her chest, and of course the barbs of scorn. She just looks so badass. And the fact that her hair changes to match whatever hollow you're using is a super cool effect. Character design is the strongest aspect of the game. There's not too many NPCs, but they all look pretty cool, and the designs of the 7 Sins are a standout. It's the environmental design where the game completely falls flat. The painted look of Darksiders 2 is gone and has been replaced with nothing. So a lot of areas in the game just look incredibly generic and could be slotted into pretty much any post-apocalyptic game. Most of the zones in the game are retreads of similar locations in Darksiders 1. The Maker Tree area is similar to Ulfane's domain in the first game, including Ulfane himself. The Nether is very similar to the Iron Canopy, but not as interesting. The Scar is pretty much exactly like the Ashlands, but not as interesting. And the Hollows is very similar to the Twilight Cathedral, but not as interesting. I don't know how to describe it other than that the art direction feels muddled. The world doesn't feel in keeping with the cartoony look of the characters. The effect reminds me of the old LEGO Batman games, where you would have these bright cartoony LEGO characters running around in these regular dark gothic buildings. It just looks off. The worst area in the game is the Bonelands, which is unique to Darksiders 3, but it's an industrial shipyard full of muck and rust, and it's just so boring. It doesn't play with the fantasy aspects of the series at all, and it's also where you'll find all those missing textures, which certainly doesn't help. On the opposite end, you have the Depths, a massive underwater area full of ancient ruins and bioluminescent corals. Why is it here? Who cares? It looks cool, and it's the only area in the game that feels like it's doing something new and interesting with the setting. But it's so unconnected from the rest of the game that it still feels jarring, and the interconnectedness of the areas just amplifies that feeling. Walking through a small cave will take you from verdant greens to a sandy desert. It doesn't make visual sense. It's tempting to blame this lack of cohesion in the art direction on the lack of Jomad's guiding hand, but Jomad, by his own admission, is mostly a character designer. In fact, he actually did do some concept work for Fury and a couple other main characters. It's all just very disappointing, because it makes the world boring to explore, when exploring is the entire drive of this kind of Metroidvania-style level design. There's never anything interesting to discover. Oh my goodness, another dingy warehouse? So exciting! Interestingly, the game's one major DLC expansion seems to exist to answer this very critique of the main game. Technically, there's 2 DLC packs, but the first one just adds the Crucible from Darksiders 2, something I didn't talk about at all because I find it incredibly boring. It's just an endurance run challenge mode of endless combat. The Keepers of the Void DLC is much more interesting. In keeping with Souls-like design, it's designed to be integrated into a playthrough instead of being played after the fact. But it's also designed much more like a Zelda dungeon than anything in the base game. The Void is the dimension that Vulgrim dips into to get around so quickly, using what he calls the Serpent Holes. In the first game, instead of just fast travelling, you actually walk these paths yourself, and there's even some collectibles to find along some of the paths. Vulgrim sends in Fury because there's some hostile rock monsters infesting the place, making it difficult for him to get about. The Void has 4 wings, and each wing is unlocked with each new hollow you unlock. So these dungeons function as trial areas for the mechanics of each hollow. You also unlock a new form of Scorn at the end of each wing. The level design and art direction in the Void is much more interesting than the base game. It's nothing fancy, it's quite stark, but it's something new and weird, and there's a surprising amount of variation in the stone golem creatures you fight there. Each boss fight shares the same design, although mechanically they're some of the best bosses in the game, and the only ones I actually found somewhat challenging. It's a taste of what Darksiders 3 could have been if it didn't feel the necessity to return to Earth again, if it had committed to full fantasy like Darksiders 2 and done something completely unique. Although, as mentioned, even the Void is a concept from Darksiders 1, but Darksiders 3 explores the concept much more thoroughly. It even has a good twist. It turns out that the silent bog creatures aren't a hostile invader like Vulgrim said, they're the native species of the Void, and Fury has just spent the last few hours genociding the better part of their race. She feels a little remorseful about that, but it's too little too late as far as the big boss golem is concerned. It's a solid expansion that builds on the themes of the base game. Fury is impulsive, she acts without thinking and without consideration. And that attitude combined with her power makes her incredibly dangerous to everyone around her, even to herself. That's the narrative throughline that makes Darksiders 3 worthwhile even with all its issues. It was inevitable that the 7 deadly sins would be introduced to the Darksiders mythos eventually. They're probably a more famous concept than the 4 horsemen, and personifying them as boss fights just makes too much sense. I really enjoy the art direction of all 7 sins because they have absolutely no unifying theme. They're not really people or creatures, they're personifications of concepts, and so they appear in whatever way best represents them. Sloth, for example, is a giant bug on a throne being carried around by other bugs. He sits fat and lazy while his worker drones do all the work for him. Meanwhile, Pride looks like an angel, resplendent in gold armour and flowing robes. The absolute winner on the design front though is Lust, because they rejected the obvious path of making Lust a busty lady who wants to have sex with everything. Instead, Lust is an androgynous armoured warrior with maleficent horns. We often associate lust with a desire for sex, but the word is more open-ended than that. The sin of lust simply means an intense, overwhelming desire for something. Fury doesn't desire sex, she's just not that kind of girl, so lust takes a form much more sitting to Fury's actual desires. Or at least what lust assumes Fury desires. But lust also makes a few interesting points. Several of the sins do. Why is lust a sin? Why is pride a sin? What does sin mean in a world like Darksiders? What does sin mean in our world? Unlike the 4 horsemen, the 7 deadly sins are not a biblical concept. They were codified hundreds of years later by the Church and made most famous by the Divine Comedy of Dante Alighieri. Pride, greed, wrath, lust, envy, gluttony, and sloth. 7 qualities that will send you on a bus straight to some bizarre and ironic punishments in hell, at least according to Dante. Sin has always been a concept where me and the Church have some fundamental disagreements, because I've always struggled to understand why, within the logic of Christianity, an all-powerful God would allow sin, or to an even greater extent, why he would allow any bad things to exist at all. This is baby's first religious question, and your response to the answer will most likely determine if capital C Christianity is for you. Darksiders 3 calls this the riddle of sorrows. In the real world, it's more commonly called the problem of evil. If God is all-powerful and God is all-good, then why does God allow bad things to happen? Why does he allow sin? Consulting different Christian scholars and schools will give you 100 different answers to this question. And to be honest, I went down a bit of a rabbit hole myself because as an atheist, I find Christians talking about their faith to be kind of surreal. Because to me, there's no answer where God doesn't come across as a self-entitled jackass. Most versions of this question are answered with some form of, God allows sin because God gave us free will, because we can only truly love God if we are given the choice not to love God. God often allows us to make free will decisions because he desires us to love him, and love can only come from an individual's free will. If God directed every decision we made throughout life, where would our desire to love him come from? We would be nothing more than automatons. What would be the point of prayer, witnessing to others, or having his love letter available to read and apply to our lives? I find this answer utterly unconvincing and utterly bizarre. First of all, it's an answer which assumes the existence of God as a given, which is a non-starter when that's usually the real question being asked with this question. Secondly, it comes across as exceptionally creepy to me. God allows us to sin because it pleases him more when we follow his rules willingly. What a weirdo! Why should I do anything for this dude's pleasure? Oh, because he'll send me to hell if I don't? Then it's not really much of a choice, is it? As someone with a natural suspicion of authority, I find this entire setup extremely suspect. The second argument is typically the concept of objective morality. Good and evil can only be measured by the existence of an absolute moral deity. I found a Christian review of Darksiders 3 that makes this exact point. The riddle of sorrows spoken of in the opening cinematic directly brings up the problem of evil, going so far as to ask if sin is divine if it is a part of the creator's world. Of course, the very idea of sin being divinely supported or intended is philosophically incoherent. An amoral deity leaves no room for evil because there is no such thing as good. and a morally good deity is the only possible standard for actual moral obligations, without which nothing is good or evil, only preferred or not preferred. I also don't find this argument very convincing because I don't believe in objective morality, which is often where arguments against atheism instantly fall apart. Is evil really a thing? First, we should notice that this question contains a hidden assumption right up front. Specifically, if God doesn't exist, what does evil mean? Good and evil are words associated with a moralistic worldview, but if God doesn't exist, if materialism is all there is, then there's no objective basis for any moral construct. What we call good and evil are just social strategies for getting ahead in life and propagating your genes to the next generation. And who's to make a moral judgment about such social strategies? Indeed, in such a world, there are only effective and ineffective social strategies. As an example, Genghis Khan slaughtered roughly 40 million people, but about 1 in 200 men in the world are descended from him. So, was he evil or just very effective at winning in the Darwinian survival of the fittest contest that must be the way an atheistic world works? If an atheist is going to be self-consistent, the proper response isn't that Genghis was evil, but rather that he was supremely effective. No, actually, I think Genghis Khan was pretty evil. This is an argument based entirely on the false assumption that atheists secretly believe in objective morality, but that's not true. Some do, and they have their own justifications for that, but I don't. I have my own set of values and beliefs about right and wrong. Those beliefs are rooted in a huge array of individual factors, but I do not believe that my values are objectively correct. A Christian sees this as a contradiction. If they're not objectively correct, then why do you follow them? They're meaningless. But they're meaningful to me because I see no alternative. I behave with kindness and generosity towards others because it makes them feel better, helps them do better. And I have decided that making people happy is a good thing. Is that an objective truth? No, but it's my truth. I can condemn Genghis Khan because he spread chaos and destruction and misery in his wake, and I don't have to give him props just because he had a very large amount of non-consensual children. Can I objectively prove that he was evil? No. But who cares? I believe he was evil based on my own personal values, and as it happens, most of society agrees with this belief, which is why his actions are now illegal. Darksiders 3 is about these ideas and this conflict. It's literally the first word spoken in the game. This is a universe where God is an objective fact. There is a grand creator of the universe. But the series has never accepted that just because this figure exists, that this figure should be trusted or worshipped without question. In personifying the 7 deadly sins as physical beings, it directly invokes the problem of evil. The creator absolutely, 100% either created sin or allows it to exist without doing anything to stop it. And the creator offers no explanation for his actions. Any explanation for his actions are imposed on him by others, like the Charred Council. This is fundamentally what religion is across the globe. People trying to make sense of the universe, trying to apply logic and patterns and understanding to something that is fundamentally unknowable. God did not define the 7 deadly sins as deadly or sins. The church did that, and a skeptic like me may question their reasons for doing so. In this way, the Charred Council is shifted from being the direct stand-in for God and is instead the stand-in for the institution of Christianity. And those are two very different things, even within religious theology. They are the self-proclaimed enforcers of the Creator's will, and whether that's truly the case or not is irrelevant. Because even if it's not true, the Creator has done nothing to stop them from exerting their control over the universe. It's not the Creator that applies an objective moral framework to things, it's the Charred Council, using the Creator as a basis. They have decreed that the balance is absolute, they have decreed that sin is pure evil, and because they speak for the Creator, their law is absolute, their law is objective fact. So what does it mean then to disagree with the facts? There's an idea that life without this kind of objective moral framework is meaningless. Atheism is simply a synonym for nihilism, the belief that nothing matters and everything is pointless. In the beginning of Darksiders 3, Fury is absolutely a nihilist. She believes in nothing, she cares about nothing, she is bored with life, and this makes her a terrible, unlikable person. In facing each of the 7 sins, Fury comes face to face with reflections of herself. In wrath, she sees her unrelenting anger and arrogance towards everything and everyone. In sloth, she sees her own laziness and apathy towards her duties and her place in the world. In pride, she sees her own self-entitlement and dangerous, arrogant confidence in her own abilities. But the real turning point is her confrontation with lust. Lost shows Fury a vision of exactly what she said she wanted at the beginning of the game. The other Horsemen come in and tell Fury that she has been declared the new leader of the Horsemen and her brothers bow down before her. Rather than being fulfilled or satiated by this vision, Fury is outraged. This isn't what she wanted. This isn't what she wanted at all. In fact, the sight of her brothers kneeling before her is disturbing to her. It's wrong. Fury is immune to lust's influence because Fury doesn't truly lust for anything. She has no purpose in her life. She thought she did. She thought she wanted to be recognised for her power and her abilities, but she was wrong, which opens up a whole series of questions about her own self-image. She has a duty, she's an enforcer of the Charred Council, an agent of the balance, but she's never found meaning in that role, and this business with the sins is only making her question that role even further. In the ruins of Earth, balance starts to seem like a wasteful pursuit, or at the very least the balance of perpetual war that the Council maintains. Creation is flawed and its overseers are corrupt. To not question the status quo is not only dangerous, it's self-destructive. This is where the Lord of Hollows comes in. Like the Crowfather in Darksiders II, the Lord of Hollows is a being who exists outside of the binary of heaven and hell. A being more ancient than either of them. He taunts Fury about her lack of knowledge and insight and proves her brashness with a test that looks like a fight, but in reality the Shades don't attack. He was just proving how quickly Fury jumps to violence. The Lord of Hollows represents an alternate path. He was once a member of the Charred Council, but he chose to defy their laws, and defy the mandate set by the Creator. He chose his own path, and that's what Fury needs to do as well. This is where humanity enters the picture. As part of his penance for starting the apocalypse in the first place, Ulthane has set up a sanctuary for any surviving humans to seek refuge in. Fury agrees to send any human she finds his way, in exchange for his services as a blacksmith. Initially, Fury does not care about the humans at all. She views this purely as a transaction. But as she wanders the ruins of their civilization and finds the few remaining souls huddled in fear for their survival, she begins to feel an emotion that she's always worked hard to avoid feeling. Empathy. Empathy is a dangerous emotion for a nihilist to have because empathy means that you care, and caring is antithetical to nihilism. One human in particular, a guy called Jones, serves as a demonstration of this. He's a regular guy, sick of all this divine bullshit, sick of being caught in the middle of this war that humanity had nothing to do with. Maybe the humans are weak and pathetic compared to her, but that doesn't mean they deserve what has happened to them. This newfound discovery of empathy triggers a change in Fury, a change that she doesn't really know what to do with. She doesn't know what she wants to do, she just wants to do something that isn't what she's been doing so far. Fury's arc across the game is fascinating to watch unfold because as it goes along, she gets less chatty and more introspective. You can see this in the contrast between her two fights with Wrath. The first time she is all bark, all talk, and all rage. The second time she doesn't engage with his banter at all and just gets right down to business, much to the annoyance of Wrath. This all comes down to the only choice the game gives you, whether or not you're going to fight the Lord of Hollows. He's an enigmatic figure, his plans for the future are strange, forbidden, and against the very plans of the Creator. It would be perfectly understandable not to trust him, but the narrative drive is to spare him. That's the only way to get the true ending of the game. You have to choose the unknown. The Lord of Hollows reveals that humanity's extinction was not an accident, but the deliberate intention of the entire war. The forces of the universe fear humanity, because humanity are, like the Nephilim once were, a fusion of heaven and hell. The personification of balance. If humanity personifies the balance, then what use is the Charred Council and their balance of war? That's their logic, and so they simply let humanity be destroyed. The Lord of Hollows seeks to rectify that. He has collected millions of souls with the intention of using that power to help humanity reach their potential. How exactly is unclear, but he has his becoming, which apparently transforms him into a little glowy talisman, which he gives to Fury for safekeeping. It's very much another thing set up for Darksiders 4 to tackle, but it is an important step in Fury's journey.
To achieve balance and save this world from heaven and hell, one must choose a side. I have chosen mine. It's you, Fury. Now, what do you choose?
I choose life.
It is a good feeling to have a purpose again.
I've always found the Christian idea that life without God would be meaningless to be very unconvincing. So there's no divine plan, so suffering happens randomly with no rhyme or reason. So there is nothing after life and no karmic punishment or reward for how good you were. So what? If there is no external force to give life meaning, then life's meaning has to be internal. You are not assigned a purpose in life, you choose one. Not based on whatever it's determined that some absentee creator wants, but based on what you want. Atheism is not equivalent to nihilism because the basis for morality, or at least my basis for morality, isn't God, it's empathy. Fury does not accept the Council's laws, their balance, because their balance only brings suffering and death. She chooses empathy, she chooses life, and that gives her more meaning than any divine mandate ever could. This has always been a factor of Christianity, but I find it especially meaningful in our current climate where the Christian right is waging a war against the concept of empathy, using biblical law as an excuse to justify hate, bigotry, suffering, and even genocide. Objective morality is incredibly dangerous because it's inflexible. If you truly believe that your morals are objective, then you can never change your mind. You can never make exceptions. Things are good or things are bad, and there's nothing else to it. And I'm sure there's a lot of comfort in that philosophy. It means you never have to consider the suffering your actions cause because that suffering is divinely approved. They deserve it. To choose to live outside of that certainty is the more difficult path. It's the path of constant change and constant reappraisal. But to me, and to Fury as well, it's the only path that brings true fulfillment. Not everything about this story works perfectly. For example, some of the sins just don't have that much of a lesson to teach Fury, like gluttony, which is ironic because she's the replacement for famine on the Horseman roster. You can maybe take the word less obviously, like with lust, as to mean an all-consuming hunger for something, an insatiable void, which could better describe Fury's issues. But gluttony in the game is nothing but mouths upon mouths upon mouths. It's pretty apparent we're talking about old-fashioned eating everything gluttony. It's also the worst boss fight in the game because it's based around a bunch of gimmicks, but that's besides the point. When it comes to Fury's three biggest sins, wrath, pride, and envy, the game really works. Wrath is used to demonstrate her growth across the game, pride is used to underline how that growth has changed her outlook on things, and envy represents the road not taken. The finale of Darksiders 3 is built around a series of twists. The first and most important of which is that the Watcher was not a Watcher at all, but envy in disguise. Apparently, the envy that you fight in the beginning was just a random, unrelated bird creature. This twist is well set up throughout the game, particularly by the way that the Watcher talks to Fury with such reverence and admiration for her talents and abilities, almost as if she's envious of them. She is physically the weakest of all the sins, but she covets their power and she uses Fury to get it. At the last moment of victory against Pride, she snatches the amulet which contains the rest of the sins and takes their power into herself. But what does a being of pure jealousy do when they get all the power they've always coveted? They simply go after even more power. She decides to attack the Charred Council directly, leaving Fury to die in the rubble. But she doesn't die. Instead, she's brought back to Haven by the humans she's been helping throughout the game. It's the last lesson that Fury needs to learn. Humility. Sometimes you lose, sometimes you need help, and that's okay. It doesn't make you weak. Recognizing the strength of others is what makes you strong.
I strayed from the path. I have been jealous. I have been wrathful. I have been lazy. Worse and more. All the things the seven sins stand for, and I have paid dearly for it.
So in other words, you have lived.
Yes.
Good then. You're finally alive. And with life, there is always hope.
Envy's design is a close second behind Lust. She takes a form that's a shallow approximation of each of the four horsemen. Armour like Fury, a mask and scythe like Death, a greatsword and hood like War, and a set of pistols like Strife. A being of pure envy can't have her own ideas, she simply covets what others already have, so this parody of the horsemen is perfect. This is exactly what Fury herself was like at the start of the game, envious of her brother's powers, angry at the universe. This is who she could have been without learning the lessons she has throughout the game. Envy thinks that empathy is a weakness. Why would you show compassion to those weaker than you? They are completely irrelevant to a being of pure envy, because there is nothing to envy about them. Fury saves the Council and captures Envy, but just as they did with War, the Council immediately tries to kill Fury now that her mission is complete. In fact, she was never supposed to survive the mission at all. It's never stated outright, but it is heavily implied that it was the Council themselves who unleashed the Seven Sins in the first place, and they are also the ones who killed Rampage. The Horsemen are too powerful and too outside of their control. They must be eliminated. But Fury survives thanks to the power she received from the Lord of Hollows. The sight of the talisman outrages the Council and buys her time to escape, using the Amulet of Sins as a hand grenade and jumping back through the portal to Haven. Haven is under siege by the Destroyer looking to wipe out the last of humanity, and so Fury takes on the role of their protector, ushering them to safety in places unknown, and promising to one day make things right. It would be a pretty perfect ending if it wasn't for one last, kinda baffling twist. It's the perfect resolution of Fury's arc across the game, from amoral nihilist to self-defined saviour, from performative disgust at the weak little humans to genuine empathy and assistance in their survival and growth, from never backing down from a fight to knowing when it's time to run. And then there's the twist. Rather than going with the rest of the humans, Jones charges into the fray brandishing two very familiar pistols, and reveals himself in the last 5 seconds of the game to actually be Strife, the last of the 4 horsemen. There are hints to this in the game, like how Jones only ever refers to humanity in the third person, but it's a twist that deflates the purpose of Jones within the narrative as the representative of humanity. If Jones isn't a real human, then they have no representation, because the rest of the humans are all nameless extras. They're back to having no agency in this story that is fundamentally about them. It's weird. A lot of people were hoping that Darksiders 4 would be Strife's game, so that every horseman would have at least one game to themselves before the big team-up. But I think this twist exists so that he doesn't need one. Strife, being Jones, establishes he clearly already has empathy for humanity, and has a reason to join war at the end of the first game like Death and Fury do. It also sets up why Ulthane had one of Strife's guns back in the first game. The two of them clearly know each other, even if the exact details of where Strife is during the first game is unclear. If Darksiders 4 was the Strife game, then this would be a little tease of that. With the Darksiders 4 we are getting, it's a little "and Strife was here too" footnote. Which I am okay with, because having Darksiders 4 be the one with all 4 of them just seems right. It's also quite unclear how exactly Fury protecting human survivors is supposed to work in tandem with Death resurrecting humanity in Darksiders 2, because it seems like one would make the other redundant, but I suppose that's Darksiders 4's problem to solve. Darksiders 3 is the awkward middle child of the franchise, which in fairness is pretty in keeping with Fury herself. It's a bit broken, it's a bit underwhelming, but damn it, it's still got a lot of good stuff in it anyway. It's the game that's the most direct with its religious themes in a way that I find really interesting, and once you get over the hump, it is very fun to play. I wish Darksiders 3 was better. I wish it was able to live up to the standard of the first 2 games, but I am still glad that it exists. Because what I really value about Darksiders isn't the story or the world, but that core commitment to game developers making the coolest shit possible. As long as that core ethos remains true, then the franchise will never truly be without value. If anything, the scrappy nature of Darksiders 3 just enhances that feeling. They aimed high, and they missed, but the attempt is still something to see. Darksiders 4 will be the one to continue and, most likely, conclude this story. But there's still space for one more story to tell, right? We just have to go back, way, way back to find it. So why don't you join me next time, for the last time, at the genesis of it all.
Thank you, Maker. May our future be one of justice.
Aye. Safe travels, horseman.
for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to see your name up here, or just support the things that I do, then please consider signing up. It would mean a lot to me. As well as a like, comment, share, subscribe, and hype. Apparently you can hype things now. I'm pretty sure it doesn't really do anything, but it couldn't hurt to give me a hype. So, hype. I like hype. To see the previous entries in this series, you can click up here, or if you want to know the top tips to success on YouTube, then you should join my friend John Flimflam down here for all the hottest tips. I promise, it's not a scam.